welcome to this next talk in our series of talks about Bruckner's 8th Symphony. Before I get into the second movement, I'd just like to say a couple of things about the last talk. First one is something that I should have said about the end of the first movement. This is something that Bruckner himself said about that piece in a letter, and it's this moment at the very end when we've had the climactic moment, which you can see in the score here. Whole orchestra has held this fortissimo chord, and the horns and trumpets with the timp are left playing just the rhythm of the first group of themes. And Bruckner said that's like the annunciation of death. And then he says that the next page, which I'm trying to bring up, here we are, is the Totenuhr, the hour of death. And the image that he had in his head is that a man is dying in a room, but the clock in the room ticks on when his life has passed away. So it's the dying gasps, and time still carries on when there is no life. So for once, Bruckner did actually say something about what he was thinking when he was writing the piece. He was often sort of encouraged into writing programmes for his symphonies by his supporters who couldn't conceive of instrumental music without a programme. But he was very reluctant to do this and actually bitterly resented it on occasions. Somebody was writing something about the 7th Symphony, and he said, if he's got to write poetry, why has he got to write it about my symphony? Anyway, he did say that this is what was on his mind when he wrote this particular bit of music, so I think it's fair to share it with you. And let's now go on to the second movement. I'd like to start talking about the second movement with a little bit of a personal recollection. I was once asked to conduct a rehearsal of Bruckner's 8th Symphony, and it's the first time I conducted any Bruckner, and it was, as you can imagine, a fairly daunting thing, but I wanted to do it. And it was listening to the Scherzo that really, first of all, turned me on to the piece as a whole. The Scherzo is just, it's a wonderful movement. It's got such energy and it carries you along. It's got wonderful harmony, but it's also quite straightforward to understand. At first listening, it explains itself without you having to try too hard. So what I found very interesting in putting this talk together is that actually it's a lot more complicated than you probably think at first viewing. What I've got here is a sort of overview of the whole movement. Now, I have read one person's analysis that says that the Scherzo and the trio are both in sonata form. I think that's a little bit far-fetched. It's in sonata form in that there is a sort of recapitulation, but the Scherzo in particular is monothematic. And it really is, I think, more simple than that. I think it is just a ternary form movement. When we look at the sections on the whole, as a whole thing, the tonal relationships are quite straightforward. So the Scherzo starts in C minor. Now, before we go on from that, let's remind ourselves what the first movement was like with its searching for C minor. It sort of spends ages avoiding C minor. Eventually we get there. So the Scherzo embraces C minor from the off, and that in itself has got quite an emotional effect. It's just very certain compared with all the searching that we've just been through. And that first section moves fairly expectedly to the relative major, E flat major. Here we are. The middle section does the reverse journey from E flat back to C minor, and then the A is modified on its return, and instead of going to the relative major, it goes to the tonic major. So all that is fairly straightforward and normal. Then we come to the trio. Well, that's in A flat major, which is a little bit beyond the norms. And then it moves not to its dominant or to its relative minor, but to a key enharmonically a major third away. Now let's just have a look at this. We'd started in C, we've gone down to A flat, so that's a major third, and then we move to E, which is another major third. The middle section, which is actually very short, takes us back to A flat, and then again the A section is modified, starts in A flat, goes to E and goes back to A flat. And then the Scherzo is literally and the same music all over again. In fact, it's a da capo. So fortunately for us, nothing to be said about the second return of the Scherzo. So when you see the movement written down like that, it all looks really very simple. But of course, that is far from the case. Now, before I go on to looking at the score, I'd just like to make some general points. So, this symphony, the 8th Symphony, is the first of Bruckner's symphonies that he puts the Scherzo as the second movement. Now, emotionally, that makes perfect sense. The first movement has been, I keep repeating this, but this searching, quite emotionally draining movement with huge climactic moments. And the slow movement of this symphony, which we're going to be looking at next, is a very big movement. Again, it's emotionally draining. So separating those two with the Scherzo makes perfect sense. It's also the first time that Bruckner uses a harp. And the moment when we have the harp in the trio is utterly gorgeous, beautifully done. The Scherzo itself is, again, one analysis I've looked at calls it monothematic. It's basically got two obsessive motifs which are repeated over and over and over again. Now, this is when you start to look at it bar by bar and you try to decide what the harmony is. It changes key, like the first movement, incessantly, bar by bar, maybe 2 bars by 2 bars. And there's just quite a lot of the time when you feel you're on some sort of tonal quicksand. Your feet give way the whole time. And then you have glorious moments when it just does settle in a key and it stays there. Principally in the middle of the movement, when it settles down on E major, it stays there for a long time. And because it's surrounded by this sort of chromatically shifting stuff, you enjoy that moment of repose all the more. Now, while I was looking at this, this little phrase popped into my head, a sort of riot of freedom and obsession, which I rather like. I think that's what's going on in this movement. It's obsessive because he keeps repeating the same stuff over and over and over again. But the repetitions are not exact. And if you look at the number of little variations he makes on the basic themes, they are quite considerable. And then he's also got his tonal freedom. The way that he moves around keys so deftly is quite extraordinary. So there's this obsessive repetition, but it's repetition done with great freedoms. And then another thing that Bruckner said about this movement is that it's reminiscent of a character called Der Deutsche Michael, or the German Michael. I do apologise for my pronunciation of anything that puts your teeth on edge. Now, German Michael is a personification of Germany, rather like John Bull is the personification of England. He's a character who's supposed to be a sort of rustic, easygoing, bucolic character. And that's a lot of the nature of this movement, sort of countryside open air, particularly in the trio. It's got a quality of a Ländler, which is a sort of folk tune associated with the outdoors in Austria. Again, I just need to tell you that because that's what Bruckner said. It's not necessary to understanding the music or how you feel about the music, but it is a sort of in for the way that Bruckner was feeling. It's a naive countryside character. So I think what I'm going to do this week is talk about each section of the movement as a separate thing and then just play the music for that section with the score going past, and you can see what I've written about it. I don't really want to talk over the top of it because I think it would be too difficult, to be honest. So let's have a quick look through the score of the Scherzo section. So this is the A section of the Scherzo. Starts with a horn call on the dominant, and here we have our two little motifs. The first one's a very simple idea, it's just a descending scale, and this theme is the one that's associated with the Deutsche Michael, anyway, the German Michael. And we are definitely in C minor. Just a little notice here for cellists. This is one of these scores where when it's in the treble clef you actually have to play it an octave lower. You do not play it at that pitch. It's just a sort of 19th century, it's a 19th century convention. Now, I did say we started in C minor. It's all very clear, but by the end of the first page, C minor is already gone. We've got a D flat in the bass and a sort of outline of dominant 7th or possibly augmented 6th harmony. Okay, let's go on. Now, the scale here has been inverted. We start to have sequential passages and we end up here, full orchestra in, and we're in E flat minor. So much for being definitely in C minor. Again, this is moving in sequences, taking us here to A flat minor. Now, a feature of this movement, which happens quite a few times, is that there's a pedal on top, an inverted pedal. And you see here the flutes are holding an A flat, the violins are holding an A flat. Now, that's fine when the harmony is A flat minor, but when the harmony becomes A major, that's quite dissonant. Here we've got one of the bits of freedom. That is the Michael theme, but it's not really properly inverted, but you can see that it's the same sort of shape, and we hear it as the same sort of shape, but it is not a literal inversion. Now just look at this rising sequence of chords. Still that pedal A flat is going on. We have B flat minor against it, C flat major, an augmented triad, D flat major, and then bam, A major. Absolutely extraordinary. Now that looks slightly weirder than it is if you think of D flat as being enharmonically C sharp. Then what we've got there is another root movement by a major third, which is quite a feature of this movement as a whole. Anyway, whole orchestra in A major. Where's C minor? On we go. We phrase again in E major. Now this is an extraordinary bit. A major, E major. What's going to be over the page? E flat major. It's outrageous, really. And here we have another of these pedal points. Dominant pedal on the top here. Obsessive repetition here. Just look at the number of repeats. And then over the page. This is one of my favourite moments because that dominant pedal, which we've had going on for now 8 bars, 10 bars or so, carries on with 2 horns added over a movement to the subdominant minor. So underneath here we've got a chord of A flat minor, and on top of it there's this B flat. It's just scrumptious, a wonderful dissonance. And for me, this is one of the things I'm looking for in a recording. I really want to hear that dissonance. I think it's wonderful. One of my favourite moments. And there we are. We finish this section in E flat major, which is the relative major of C minor. Everything fades down. E flat major, carrying on, and we're just left with the drum ticking on E flat. A little bit like the first movement, I suppose. Now then, the B section starts, and this is a typical Bruckner thing, that it starts with a sort of inversion of what we had before. We saw a little bit of that in the first movement. It also puts me in mind of what Bach often does in his, certainly his dance movements, in his binary form movements. The second section very often will start with an inversion of what we had in the first section. Now, I haven't gone into huge detail here because, life is short. But if you really want it, I really do recommend that you look at what's going on here. It's just glorious music. At this stage, we get to a whole passage of music based on the inversion of the Michael theme. Again, obsessively repeated. And against it, the bassoon here is playing it in the normal way around. Obsessively repeated. On it goes. Another lovely little modulating sequence coming down there. Through this, the timps are playing a tonic pedal of C, but the harmonies around it are all over the place, but the C carries on through it. The horn comes in with that little pedal figure that we heard at the very beginning of the movement, sort of bringing our attention back. And we have here the repeat of the A section, which starts, as I say, exactly the same as it did at the beginning. Well, I say exactly the same. The timp roll wasn't there before, but otherwise it's all the same. So far so good. It's a repeat of the A section, and on that goes, and we've seen all this before, and on that goes. And then at this point, it changes. So the music at letter R we have seen before, and then 5 bars after that. When we had it before, this was E major, and now it's in D flat major, down a minor third. Well, we know, having looked at my lovely graph, that this is going to end up in C major. So basically what he's doing is he's transposed, from this moment on, he's transposed down a minor third. But it's extraordinary, isn't it, that the same music can just lead into such a different key. And we scarcely notice it. It's brilliantly done. And then it carries on. Sorry, I'll just flip back there. And this is the point where we get to C major, which is our eventual goal. Again, here, I haven't marked it, but that's the same dissonant note. The music here has gone down to F minor, and top of it we have a G. That's also the pedal note in the violins here. Again, just fantastic. So exciting. And that's the end of the Scherzo. So what I'm going to do now is just play the recording of the Scherzo with the score going by, so that you can see the stuff I've just talked about in context. really love that. So then we move on to the trio, just to quickly flick through the score. So we have an A section, obviously, starting in A flat major. And again, like the Scherzo, it doesn't stay there for very long. So we start in A flat, we're shortly going up by a minor third to C flat, and then we're moving up by a third to E flat. Very chromatic, very free with his tonal slips. We have a couple of phrases here that end with imperfect cadences, this one in E major and then this one in G flat, so enharmonically upper tone. And actually a general pattern here is that some roots tend to be moving upwards. We now have an ascending sequence. Again, it's a chromatic ascent going through all this passage. D major to E flat major to E major. And this is our sort of goal key. It's interesting, where is the point of arrival here? Obviously the whole orchestra here is playing, but I would argue that actually the real moment is about to come over the page. But this is the moment of repose I was talking about, because we stay in E major now for 24 bars, and given how slow this is, that's quite a long time just to have essentially one chord being played. I'm just exaggerating slightly because you can see down here that the bass is moving, but essentially this is E major. E major with sort of horn calls and loveliness. And then here we have it, the harp comes in. And this is supposed to be our bucolic character, our Michael character, having a daydream. So you can imagine somebody just sort of lying in an alpine meadow, maybe with a blade of grass in his mouth, looking up at the clouds and just being. It's lovely. And again, this is just E major harmony with this lovely little Ländler figure in the violins. Ländler is an Austrian type of music. Schubert uses Ländler in his symphonies, and it's one of the most quintessentially Austrian things about Bruckner's writing. Okay, so that comes to an end. We have a little bit of a rest, one of Bruckner's pauses, and then there's this wonderful change of mood. It's essentially still just a chord of E major, but we've got a D natural there in the violas, which make it a dominant seventh, and an F natural in the first violins, which make it a minor ninth chord. And for a change of atmosphere, it's like a shiver down the spine. Absolutely wonderful. That gets moved up onto a G, and the chord, instead of being a minor ninth, is now a major ninth chord. Again, that sort of feels like the sun coming out. And I just wanted to highlight here that this semitone going up and down is going to be one of the main themes of the third movement. So we're just sort of getting a little pre-echo there. Now, again, just to point out, this B section, I'm going to flick back, is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 bars. It's very small amount of music. It's an odd balance between the A section and the B section, that the B section is so short. Anyway, we return to the A section, and as it was in the Scherzo, it comes back exactly as we had it first time around, same key changes. And then we get to the point where it changes. Now this is much earlier in this A section than it was in the Scherzo repeat of the A section. But this is basically new music. Starts in A major, and then if the phrase finishes in A minor. New music here, taking us to our climactic moment. To start off with, it's in C major. Then it goes up to E major, and this is the music that we had at the Daydream sequence before. But as you can see, it's not just a lot of alpine horns with gentle string and harp accompaniment. It's the whole orchestra. So it's a very different mood to this. And then there's a lovely, exquisite harmonic thing here. So the E major is loud, unlike it was before. And then he just goes from E major to A flat major, no preparation, nothing. It just happens. And we go back to the mood of this music when we had it in E major. So string chord, harp and horns. Everybody else drops out and it's back to piano or pianissimo. glorious moment, really lovely. And that brings us to the end of the trio. So now let's listen to it with the score going past. So there we have it. A wonderful, wonderful movement. And as I say, one of my favourites. Something that I haven't really talked about is the fact that it's called a scherzo, because it's hardly a joke. It's not very fast, the trio is actually marked langsam and is in 2/4 rather than in 3. So it's not a scherzo that Beethoven would recognise or even Schubert would recognise. It's a Bruckner scherzo, and it's one of his longest, and it's just brilliant. There's so many little bits of detail that I hope you will just look at the score a bit more and appreciate. There's just exquisite moment after exquisite moment. Anyway, next week we have the much more serious business of the slow movement, which is really one of the most profound things that Bruckner ever wrote. As somebody said about the first performance, if the sophisticated Viennese audience who went along to it, some of whom who went along to sneer at Bruckner and his simple country ways, they can have had no doubt that this is somebody who had something very serious and important to say, and he will undoubtedly have changed a lot of people's minds about him on that occasion. Anyway, we've got that to look forward to. So until next time, stay happy. Blah, 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 blah.